poor rebuilt where there had been nothing but suspicion, animosity, and remorse. Before we turn to the text, I also want to share with you just one brief announcement, one brief plug. The last time I had an opportunity to be in Portland was for the Restoration Forum last year. Many of you participated in that. This year the Restoration Forum is going to Texas for the first time and will be hosted at the Skillman Church on November 10, 11, and 12. If you're interested in that, whether you're going to attend or not, please feel free to pick up one of the brochures describing the program, the speakers, and the arrangements which will be here on the podium. This is going to be not only an exceptional program, it's going to be in many ways a historic one. Among the things that will happen on this program, perhaps for the first time, certainly one of the few times since the rupture between the instrumental and non, the editor of the Christian Standard and the editor of the Gospel Advocate will be on the same stage at the same time speaking on the same subject. And Sam Stone and Furman Curley have agreed to do that, recognizing that in the rift that separated the movements, their two periodicals were major factors in aggravating the distance between us. And perhaps the two of them can be part of the process of finding ways that healing can occur, and I'm looking forward to that moment. People who of ecology systems, perhaps better than people in any other part of the world, you have come to realize long before the rest of the nation was fully sensitive to it, that small, seemingly insignificant changes in one part of nature, undesirable reactions elsewhere in the system. We have, with each passing year, come to understand just how fragile this thing called nature is. Resourceful, yes. Resilient, absolutely. But fragile nonetheless. And we've learned that we have to be aware not just of individual components of nature, but the marvelous interplay of one component with another, to see the entire network of relationships and anticipate how change in one place plays through in the total ecology. Those of us who work in family counseling have come to realize that we have to look at families as an ecosystem. They are not simply a group of individuals who share the same address, roof. They are not merely a collection of paired relationships, husband and wife, mother and daughter, father and son. They are instead an ecosystem in which balance must be maintained, a network in which all of the flow of communication and rapport and respect must be carefully nurtured in order for the whole ecosystem to have health. What we discover when we look at the life of Jacob and his family is a family ecosystem completely out of balance. It is an unhealthy ecosystem we saw. The unhealthiness in this ecosystem begins to emerge right after the two sons were born. Moses tells us that when the boys grew up, verse 27, Esau became a skillful. Jacob, by contrast, was a peaceful man, living in tents. Now, Isaac, he says, loved Esau because Isaac had a taste for game. He liked what his son could do for him. But Rebekah loved Jacob. And so we have favoritism already at work as the boys are growing up. Jacob wants something, he goes to mom. Esau wants something, he goes to dad. The sons play mom and dad off against each other. It is not a system in balance. Now, we all realize that there is simply a natural affinity that we sometimes have for one child more than another. We must not feel guilty about that. We must respect the fact that just as there are adults that I feel a natural affinity to from the first time I meet them, the same is true with children. Not all children come out of the same fabric. They don't come out of the same mold. And some of my children will inevitably have more characteristics that I really thrill at than will others. Certainly not the kind of favoritism that unfolds in this story. For this is a woman who shows such favoritism to her son that she will help him deceive her own husband. His name, Jacob, turned out to be prophetic. He received it because when the two boys were born, Jacob emerged from the womb clutching to the heel of his older brother Esau. And so they gave him the name Jacob, which means to grab hold of, to usurp, to tackle. He was to be a person who laid his hands on people to manipulate them. Without stretching the meaning too far, you could say that Jacob's name meant manipulate thing. Some of you have had back injuries and you've gone to a chiropractor or a physical therapist and you wanted them to manipulate you. But as a rule, when we hear the word manipulation, we think of something rather unpleasant that's about to unfold. You see, I can lay hands on someone to bless them or to choke them. Taking something in your hands, which is what manipulation means, is in itself neither good nor bad. It's the intention that determines whether or not this is something desirable or not. And so in the passage that was read to us a while ago, when Esau and Jacob meet, Esau throws his arms around Jacob's neck. Jacob had often wondered what Esau's arms would do to his neck when they met again. In fact, it's just a few verses earlier that Jacob is described as trembling in terror at the prospect of meeting Esau. There was good reason for that. It goes back to that very day in which Rebekah, playing this game of favoritism, enticed Jacob to join her in deceiving her own husband. If you go to the 27th chapter, so I want to be sure that I give you my blessing before I die. Go kill some game for me and prepare it the way I like it prepared, and come and I will give you the blessing. Immediately, Rebekah, overhearing this, goes to Jacob and says, we've got to steal her idea to Jacob. He is at first reluctant to go along. He says in verse 11 of the 27th chapter, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me. Then I shall be as a deceiver in his sight, and I shall bring upon myself not a blessing, but a curse. He was right. He was about to bring a curse upon his whole household through his deception. Deception in a family ecosystem always brings a curse. It never brings a blessing. I'm working right now with women with deep multiple personality disorders, with men absolutely overcome by obsessive compulsions. And when we go back to the root of it, almost inevitably we find a family secret, a deception. Something that mom said to her daughter, now we must never let anyone know. Something that an incestuous father said to see in the hurting lives of many adults is the imbalanced ecosystem of the family from which they came and the deception that someone began to practice there. And Rebekah sets the stage for a lifetime of misery in her family by saying to Jacob, let's deceive your father and steal the blessing. Jacob was right to anticipate that if they did this, he would bring a curse upon the family. At last he went along. The blessing of the firstborn was given to him. He already had manipulated Esau. Manipulates his father, as he will later manipulate his father-in-law to get something which he wants. Esau discovers the treachery. He's outraged, angry, heartbroken all at once. He goes into his father with urgent entreaty and says, what are we going to do? Now, their view of one of the things you have to understand in working with Middle Eastern cultures, even in the 20th century, is that they view language differently from we Westerners. We think of language as simply a matter of convenient symbols that we use, hooking them together so as to move ideas forward, to bring about agreement and understanding, clarification of ideas. But we think of words as rather inert, innate things are things that are innately unalive, just tools to be used. But in the Eastern world, and especially in the ancient Eastern world, words were thought to live with good reason. If you reflect for a moment, you can think back to some words that were spoken to you years ago, and by simply recalling those words, you still get a bit of a pain right here. Or your heart just sort of seizes a little bit. Those words, though now ancient, hurt still. And if you reflect further, you can probably think of other words which recalled make you feel warm and good because someone at the choice moment spoke a word of blessing that opened up your sense of possibility for yourself. And just recalling that moment and getting back inside that experience can lift your spirits. Now, Eastern people, realizing that power of words, had the idea that words are not dead things. They are living things. How can something that's been dead 20 years still hurt me? How can something that's been dead 30 years still give me joy? So to them, a word had an existence, a life that could not be denied. And that's the problem for Isaac. He has given his word to Jacob. That blessing cannot be revoked. It is a done thing. He may have been manipulated into giving the wrong man the blessing, but he cannot undo it. And so he commiserates with his older son Esau. But at long last he says, I cannot give you the blessing I've given him. Esau said, then give me a blessing. And this is what the old man said to his son. Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of the heavens from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about when you become restless that you will break his yoke from your neck. Rebekah reported that conversation to Jacob. One of the things that happens to all of us is that we listen with filters. We hear what we're most sensitive to, and we miss things that we're not attentive to. And Jacob has already anticipated that his deception not only is wrong, but it invites a curse upon him. And like all people with a troubled conscience, like the central figure in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, his mind then begins to focus upon what will be the outcome. And he anticipates that the outcome will have many, many negative components. The blessing says that, but I bet you if we really knew what happened when Jacob heard the report of that blessing, those are not the words that registered with him. The words that registered with him were from two phrases. Number one, Esau will be a man who lives by the sword. And number two, when he gets fed up with you, he will break your bounds from his neck. What Jacob heard is Esau is going to be a man of violence, and one of these days, he's going to get me. We have the benefit of historical hindsight and know that Isaac's words were destined for a long-term fulfillment. Jacob didn't have that privilege. Jacob had to live every day wondering just when Dad's promise would come to fruition. Now then, Esau reacts as one might expect him to react. The 41st verse says, so Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing which his father had blessed him with. And Esau said to himself, the days of I will kill my brother Jacob. Esau did some selective listening too. He seems to have heard Dad saying, it's all right, go get him. You're a man of the sword. As Dad dies, I kill him. It's sort of like that story in David's reign. you remember some of the last words of David? There was a friend of his who had betrayed him, then pled for mercy. David said to the man, okay, so long as I live, you will live. But David could carry a grudge a long time. And on his deathbed, he called Solomon in and he said, remember what I told him, that as long as I lived, he could live? As soon as I'm dead, kill him. I want to keep my word, but like a good legalist, David keeps the letter of the law. That's sort of how Esau is. Not going to do this while Dad is alive, but as soon as Dad is out of the picture, Jacob is a dead man. Isaac foiled the plot. He didn't die soon. Isaac won't die for another 20, 30 years. We don't know how long it is, but it is long. Had the rapprochement that we read about in the opening text a while ago, because they go together and bury their father when he dies at 180. But Rebekah, not knowing but that her husband will die soon, and having heard what Jacob would face at Esau's hands when Isaac died, comes to her son and says, you need to get out of here. Now she thought this was going to be short term. Listen to her words to Jacob as she plots with him a second time. She says in verse 43 of the 27th chapter, my son, and stay with him a few days. It will be 20 years. Stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides, and he forgets what you did to him. Then I shall send and get you from there. Why should I be bereaved of both of you in the same day? Now she's going to deceive her husband again. She goes into her husband and says, you know what misery Esau has dealt us by marrying daughters of the Hittites, and what a tough time we've had with our daughters-in-law. We can't let Jacob marry Hittite women. What do you suggest we do? What if we send him back to my brother Laban and he find a wife among our people? And so she deceived her husband into calling Jacob in and sending him away with a blessing. No one knows that 20 years will pass. And I wonder how Jacob thinks about his family back home during those 20 years. Not much is said in the text about it. We know more about it from Laban's words than from Jacob's. For most of the ensuing scenes have to do with the struggle and the deceptions that go on between Laban and Jacob, and the unhealthy ecosystem that we get in between Laban and his daughters, until that ecosystem becomes so unhealthy that Jacob can't stay there any longer. Now then, Laban is going to destroy him. Laban is ready to revoke all the promises made and take Jacob's life. Jacob has at least had the foresight to get his herds and his herdsmen 3 days' journey from Laban's herds and Laban's herdsmen, so that when he discovers that the plot is afoot, it gives him a chance to get a 3-day head start. And literally overnight, he packs the family goods and says, we move. They cross the Euphrates, they start down through Gilead, and now then he is caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. He's got an angry Laban coming at him from behind and an angry Esau standing in front of him. 2 men with a score to settle. 2 men with a grudge they've been nursing. And he knows he can't go back to Laban. But can he go forward to Esau? And so with great preparation, he begins to plan his encounter with Esau. First of all, he takes his herds and his herdsmen and he divides them into 2 camps, because when he first sent word to Seir that he was coming, his messengers came back and said, Esau said he would come meet you, and he's bringing 400 men. Now, how do you read that? You know the facts. You don't know the intentions. My 20 years of work in military intelligence have made me appreciate how deeply the difference is between knowing the facts and knowing the other man's intentions. Many times before the Soviet Union fell, we could look at the satellite imagery and we knew the facts of what were there on the ground. Question was, what do they intend to do with it? So Jacob's got some good intelligence here. The intelligence is, Esau is coming to me. Is this a welcoming party or an assassination squad? Which is it? he decides he better hedge his bets. So he puts half of his herd and his herdsmen in one camp, and half of his herds and his herdsmen in another camp. And the rationale he offers is, if Esau falls upon one company, the other company can get away. At least I won't lose but half of what I have. Jacob always out to protect his possessions. Get more, hold on to what he has. And then as he thinks about it further, he says, maybe I can buy him off. I'm surprised throughout this story at how little respect and regard Jacob has for Esau. First of all, outwit him, outsmart him, outmaneuver him. And then he thinks Esau is of livestock. And so he takes his herd and he starts selecting out of it hundreds and hundreds of livestock, camels and cows and donkeys and rams and ewes. And he starts sending them before him in droves with one group of drivers and another group of drivers. And each time Esau will meet a group of drivers, they are instructed to say to Esau, these are a gift from your brother Jacob. And Jacob believes that at each increment he will soften Esau's feelings a little bit, that he can buy him off. Unbeknownst to Jacob, Esau has become wealthy in his own right. These things don't mean anything to Esau. But you know what has come to be important to Esau over all these years? Not settling scores, but having his brother back. Rebekah was right. Given enough time, Esau's anger has been assuaged. But his motive is that he longs. These 20 years, Esau's been taking care of the old man, blind this long time, a mother aged, huge herds and flocks to be tended to. And how many times as he was taking care of mom and dad and the family business, he must have heard dad say, I'd sure love to see Jacob. Hear Rebekah say, wonder where my boy is. Would love to have him back. That a healthy family ecology is far more getting even, getting your pound of flesh. And he's coming to meet Joseph, not with 400 armed men, but with 400 experienced herdsmen, to help him move his family and his goods south to their new home. And he runs to him not to choke him, but to throw his arms around his neck. Now, what happens in an ecology system, let me say by closing, when we begin in families to practice deception, is that four things almost always happen. First of all, there's going to be a great deal of remorse sometime, somewhere. Deception will eventually. When Jacob ran from Esau to Laban and found himself at the mercy of a father-in-law and some brothers-in-law who were, how many times he must have longed back home. That her petty ambition of getting a blessing for her son would cost her the comfort of that son in her old age. Deception leads to remorse. Deception, secondly, leads to resentment. Esau, the grudge. And as it leads to resentment, then it leads to recrimination, name-calling, stereotyping. That deceiver, that manipulator of his fury, you named him right when you called him Jacob. He has usurped everybody and everything he's ever gotten his hands on. Recrimination. And healing never occurs in an atmosphere of name-calling. And so, the remorse, the recrimination, then leads to an atmosphere in which we start talking about retaliation. Getting even. Getting my pound of flesh. Now what happens when remorse and resentment and recrimination and retaliation all out of balance and this family has lost its health? The only way you ever get it back in balance is for someone to be the Esau. To want the relationships to be healthy so badly that he's willing to let the wrongs simply be wrongs, and to pursue that wonderful word that is used in the New Testament to describe what God did with us through Jesus Christ, reconciliation. Unhealthy family ecosystems become healthy only at the point that people give up the agenda of retribution and move toward an agenda of reconciliation. Scores that will never be settled. There are some, as Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes, but the relationships are so important that letting the wrongs be wrongs, letting the deceptions simply be forgotten, are a small price to pay. And so two older men, arms around each other's necks, wept, the text says. What did they weep for, I wonder? Surely they wept for the wasted years. Surely they wept for the heartbreak they had caused their parents in their old age, for the failure for uncles to know their nephews and nieces as they were growing up as toddlers around the tents. So many missed opportunities because one was a deceiver and the other was a holder of grudges, a network. Is it a healthy ecosystem? Are there resentments? Are they revenge-seeking and loss of health? Maybe you need to be the Esau in that family. You need to be the one who first said, because the rapport and the relation is more important than anything else in this world. As I talk on these subjects to people, almost inevitably I find that there are some sensitive nerves that we touch, because so many of us are coming from unhealthy ecosystems in our homes or in our larger family. If this morning, from reflecting upon this ancient story but so contemporary in its dynamics, you find yourself wishing for greater spiritual and emotional reserves and resolves to go back into that ecosystem and bring healing and health, and our prayers with you could help you for health, a rebirth of that system that God wants our families to look like. We can do that. Please come while we stand and sing.